Welcome to this recording on fallacies, specifically on violations of the Unexpressed Premise Rule, and that's Rule 5 of the Rules for Critical Discussion. Now this rule reads as follows. A party may not deny a premise that he or she has left implicit, or not falsely present something as a premise that has been left unexpressed by the other party. So this is quite technical, but let's explain it by means of an example. Here we have a discussion between A and B, and A argues she might be allergic to cats. She sneezes every time she's around Molly, and presumably Molly is a cat. And then B reacts with, that's crazy, a little bit of sneezing doesn't make you allergic to cats. Now take a closer look at the argument that A presents. She says, she, the person referred to, sneezes every time she is around Molly. So it's a structural thing here. While B presents it as a little bit of sneezing, and that it doesn't mean that you're allergic to cats. So something is going on here. B misrepresents what A exactly has said. And we can say it's actually a fallacy here. It's a fallacy of magnifying an unexpressed premise. Now, the question is, why is it magnifying an unexpressed premise? And for that, we need to take a closer look at unexpressed premises. And for that, in turn, we can make use of logic. Insights from logic are very helpful in making explicit unexpressed elements in arguments. And this is a little bit of a recap because we've discussed this before, but some reasoning forms are automatically logically valid. And logically valid, that means that the standpoint, or the conclusion as logicians want to say, cannot be untrue if the arguments or premises, as the logicians say, are true. So in other words, the reasoning is fully waterproof. It's fully logically connected. There cannot be any doubt about the conclusion if you accept the premises. And there are two standard forms of reasoning that are always logically valid, and those are the modus ponens and the modus tollens. And in both these reasoning forms, you have a premise 1, which reads, if P, then Q. And then premise 2 differs. For modus ponens, it's P, and for modus tollens, it's not Q. So the difference between the ponens and the tollens is that there's a negation in the modus tollens. And the conclusion that you can draw from these reasonings is for modus ponens, Q, and for modus tollens, not P. Now this sounds a bit odd actually reading it out loud, but if you fill out the P's and the Q's, you actually just get a normal kind of argument. So these forms are very helpful not only in understanding relations between P's and Q's and maybe doing some kind of calculations with this, but also for reconstructing unexpressed elements in the argumentation. And I can show you that by means of the example that we just saw, the Molly example. So here what we have is a standpoint. She might be allergic to cats because an argument follows then she sneezes every time she's around Molly. So the standpoint we know in the reasoning schemes is always that follows from therefore. And we also see no negations here. So presumably the modus ponens is the one that we can need to reconstruct this argument. And then we know that she might be allergic to cats as Q. And then the only thing is that we should see what else we have. And that is sneezing every time she's around Molly. And there's no clear link between sneezing and being allergic made explicit. So we know then that she sneezes every time she's around Molly should be our P. I can reconstruct it as follows. So we drop the modus tollens and we leave in if P then Q because it is implicit in this argument. But we fill out P, that is, she sneezes every time she's around Molly, and we fill out Q. She might be allergic to cats. Now this is a simple filling out exercise actually. So now that we have P and Q, we can just make explicit our premise 1. And maybe it helps, I color-coded the P's and the Q's. So the only thing we have to do now is saying that if she sneezes every time she is around Molly, then Q, she might be allergic to cats. So there we go. And this is actually the logical minimum. It is the minimal addition that you have to make the reasoning logically valid. Now, it's not very informative because it's repeating just what is being said in premise 2 in the conclusion. So we might actually generalize it a bit more to achieve the pragmatic optimum. And we have good reasons for that, because there's no reason to believe that it only holds for this she that we refer to, or only for Molly the cat. I mean, it is something that is probably more general for cats in general and for persons in general. So what we can do is replace the if P then Q by means of a more general utterance like sneezing every time you are around cats is a symptom of being allergic to them. Now this shows actually that B, in this example, he misrepresents this unexpressed premise of A a little bit. He says a little bit of sneezing doesn't make you allergic to cats. Now that's not at all what A claims. A says it's serious. Sneezing is happening every time she's around Molly. So I would say here that indeed it is a violation of this rule, of the unexpressed premise rule, and that it is a magnification of an unexpressed premise. And that is one of the fallacies you can commit by violating this rule. The other one is, and we haven't talked about that, but now we do, is denying an unexpressed premise. So one example of this last possible fallacy here, we have here a discussion between A and B, again, very original. And A says David must be Canadian and gives an argument for it. He loves maple syrup. Now B says, come on, that isn't at all a clear indication of Canadianness. And I'm not sure whether this is actually a real word, but please bear with me. Then A replies with, well, I didn't say that, did I? And technically speaking, A didn't say it, didn't literally say it, but if you use the modus ponens here, he is definitely committed to it. We have, he loves maple syrup as the P here. We have Q, David must be Canadian. So if P, then Q. If he loves maple syrup, then David must be Canadian. Or if you wanted to make it more nuanced, then if someone loves maple syrup, it's an indication of Canadianness. And that is exactly what B questions. So in this sense, it is fair that B questions this, but unfair that A says, okay, I didn't say this. So here we have an example of denying an unexpressed premise. So let me return to the rule and its possible fallacies. A last thing that I want to say about this rule, and specifically these fallacies, is that the fallacies look very much like a straw man fallacy. And those fallacies were violations of the standpoint rule, which is rule 2 for critical discussion. But the difference between these fallacies and the straw man fallacy is that the straw man always concerns the standpoint of the opponent. So you either misrepresent the standpoint or you act as though the other party has the standpoint, while that's not at all the case. And here it's all about the linking premise, the bridging premise, so the if P then Q, not at all about the standpoint. So that's the main, that is the difference between these fallacies. Okay, I hope this was clear. Thanks for listening, and let's stay in contact. If you have any questions, any issues at all, just let me know, and talk to you soon.